wanted to read a portion out of this book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I was reading it last night, and the section I happened to be reading was the medical evidence for the crucifixion and the resurrection. Mr. Strobel is interviewing an Alexander Metherell, who's an MD and a PhD. I'm just going to read exactly from the book. I had sought out Metherell because I heard he possessed the medical and scientific credentials to explain the crucifixion. I had been told he could discuss the topic dispassionately as well as accurately. Could you paint a picture of what happened to Jesus? I asked. He cleared his throat. It began after the Last Supper, he said. Jesus went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, specifically to the Garden of Gethsemane. Since we knew the amount of suffering he was going to have to endure, or since he knew, he was quite naturally experiencing a great deal of psychological stress. I told him the Gospels tell us he began to sweat blood at this point. This is a known medical condition called hemathodromus. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of philosophical stress, Metherell said. What happens is that severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into those glands, or to these glands, and the sweat glands come out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood, it's just a very, very small amount. I pressed on. Did this have any other effect on the body? What this did was set up the skin to be extremely fragile so that when Jesus was flogged by the Roman soldiers the next day, his skin would be very, very sensitive. So I'm skipping sections. Then tell me, I said, what was the flogging like? Skipping another couple paragraphs. The back would be so shredded that part of the spine was sometimes exposed by the deep, deep cuts. The whipping would have gone all the way from the shoulders down to the back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs. One physician who has studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. A third historian described the flogging by saying, the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. We know that many people would die from this kind of beating even before they could be crucified. At the very least, the victim would experience tremendous pain and go into hypovolemic shock. What does hypovolemic shock mean, I ask? Hypo means low, vol means volume, refers to volume, and epic means blood. So hypovolemic shock means the person is suffering the effects of losing a large amount of blood, the doctor explained. This does four things. First, the heart races to try to pump blood that isn't there. Second, the blood pressure drops, causing fainting or collapse. Third, the kidneys stop producing urine to maintain what volume is left. And fourth, the person becomes very thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. And he talks about skipping again, we're going down to the agony of the cross. Historians are unanimous that Jesus survived the beating that day and went on to the cross, which is where the real issue lies. Okay, skipping again. The Romans used spikes that were 5 to 7 inches long and tapered to a sharp point. They were driven through the wrists, Murtherall said, pointing about an inch or so below his left palm. Hold it, I interrupted. I thought the nails pierced his palms. Through the wrist, Murtherall repeated. This was a solid position that would lock the hand. If the nails had been driven into the palms, his weight would have caused the skin to tear and he would have fallen off the cross. So the nails went through the wrists, although this was considered part of the hand in the language of the day. And it's important to understand that the nails would go through the place where the medium nerve runs. This is the largest nerve going out to the hand, and it would be crushed by the nail that was being pounded in. What sort of pain would that have produced, I ask? Let me put it this way, he replied. Do you know the kind of pain you feel when you bang your elbow and hit your funny bone? That's actually another nerve called the ulna nerve. It's extremely painful when you accidentally hit it. Well, picture taking a pair of pliers and squeezing and crushing that nerve. That effect would be similar to what Jesus experienced. The pain was absolutely unbearable. In fact, it was literally beyond words to describe. They had to invent a new word, excruciating. Literally, excruciating means out of the cross. At this point, Jesus was hoisted as the crossbear was attached to the vertical stake, and the nails were driven through Jesus' feet. Again, the nerves in his feet would have been crushed, and there would have been a similar type of pain. Both shoulders would have been dislocated. Down to the section on the cause of death. Once a person is hanging in the vertical position, crucifixion is essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. The reason is that the stresses on the muscles and diaphragm put the chest into the inhaled position. Basically, in order to exhale, the individual must push up on his feet so the tension on the muscles would be eased for a moment. In doing so, the nail would tear through the foot, eventually locking up against the tarsal bones. After managing to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloodied back against the coarse wood of the cross. This would go on until exhaustion would take over and the person wouldn't be able to push up and breathe anymore. As the person slows down his breathing, he goes into what is called respiratory acidosis. The carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. In fact, with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death, which is when he was able to say, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit," and then he died of cardiac arrest. even before he died, and this is important too, the hypovolemic shock would have caused a sustained rapid heartbeat that would have contributed to heart failure, resulting in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called a pericardial effusion, as well as around the lungs, which is called a pleural effusion. Why is that significant? Because of what happened when the Roman soldier came around and, being fairly certain that Jesus was dead, confirmed it by thrusting a spear into his right side. It was probably his right side. That's not certain. But from the description, it was probably the right side between the ribs. The spear apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. So when the spear was pulled out, some fluid, the pericardial effusion and the pleural effusion, came out. This would have the appearance of a clear fluid like water, followed by a large volume of blood, as the eyewitness John described in his gospel. John probably had no idea why he saw both blood and a clear fluid come out. Certainly that's not what an untrained person like him would have anticipated. Yet John's description is consistent with what modern medicine would expect to have happened. Wait a minute, Doc, I protested. When you carefully read what John said, he saw blood and water come out. He intentionally put the words in that order. But according to you, the clear fluid would have come out first. I'm not a Greek scholar, Murtherall replied. But according to people who are, the order of words in ancient Greek was determined not necessarily by sequence but by prominence. This means that since there was a lot more blood than water, it would have made sense for John to mention the blood first. And skipping down, it says, many years ago there was an article in the Harvard Theological Review that concluded there was astonishing little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. Dr. Marathol said no. Archaeology has now established that the use of nails was historical. In 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem found the remains of about 36 Jews. One victim had been crucified, and sure enough, they found a 7-inch nail still driven into his feet, with small pieces of olive wood from the cross still attached. Says one of the points of dispute concerns the expertise of the Romans to determine whether Jesus was dead. Dr. Murthenall says, I'll grant you that these soldiers didn't go to medical school, but remember that they were experts in killing people. That was their job, and they did it very well. They knew without a doubt when a person was dead, and it's really not so terribly difficult to figure out. Besides, if a prisoner somehow escaped, the responsible soldiers would be put to death themselves. So they had a huge incentive to make absolutely sure that each and every victim was dead when he was removed from the cross. The final argument from skeptics: is there any possible way that Jesus could have survived this? Murtherall shook his head. Absolutely not, he said. Remember that he was already in hypovolemic shock from the massive blood loss even before the crucifixion started. couldn't have faked his death because you can't fake the inability to breathe for long. Besides, the spear thrust into his heart would have settled the matter. The last thing he's talking about is an argument that nobody has been able to refute ever since it was first advanced by German theologian David Strauss in 1835 regarding Jesus' death and resurrection. Listen, Murtherall said, a person in that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he's the Lord of life who had triumphed over the grave. After suffering that horrible abuse, with all the catastrophic blood loss and trauma, he would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have hailed him as a victorious conqueror of death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to health. So it's preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a resurrection body like his. There's just no way. Jesus intentionally walked into the arms of his betrayer. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't defend himself at his trial. He was willingly subjecting himself to what you describe as a humiliating and agonizing form of torture. Jesus knew what was coming, and he was willing to go through it because this was the only way he could redeem us. By serving as our substitute and paying the death penalty that we deserve because of our rebellion against God. That was his whole mission in coming to earth. So when you ask what motivated him, Murtherall concluded, well, I suppose the answer could be summed up in one word, and that would be love.